Rommel had brilliance. That was never in question. In the open desert, with his back against a shrinking supply line and his eyes on a horizon that kept retreating, he operated on instinct, improvisation, and a kind of battlefield poetry that made military historians reach for superlatives they rarely used. But Patton was staring at something Rommel never had access to. Not a better plan, not a better mind. Something structural, systemic, and almost impossible to defeat. And the question that haunted the professionals who studied both men was not who was smarter. The question was grimmer than that. What happens when genius meets a machine that never sleeps, never hungers, and never runs out of shells? By the time George Patton arrived in North Africa in late 1942, the narrative around Erwin Rommel had already hardened into legend. The German press had manufactured a myth. The British press had unintentionally reinforced it, and Allied soldiers had started doing something dangerous. They had started believing that what stood between them and victory was a single extraordinary man. Rommel had become, in the imagination of the war, bigger than his army, bigger than his supply chains, bigger than the structural realities that governed every military campaign in history. Patton saw it differently. He had spent years inside the American military's evolving doctrine of mobile warfare, and what he understood, sometimes more clearly than his contemporaries, was that a general, however brilliant, was never truly fighting alone. A general fought with everything behind him: the fuel depots, the railway lines, the replacement pools, the industrial output thousands of miles away, the political will to keep the machine running even when the numbers turned ugly. Rommel's machine was breaking before Patton ever faced him directly. German supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were being sunk with regularity. Italian port facilities were strained. Fuel shortages were not occasional inconveniences. They were becoming structural paralysis. A tank commander without fuel is not a commander. He is a man waiting inside an expensive metal box for someone to tell him the war is already lost. What Patton brought to the contest was not simply aggression or theatrical confidence. He brought the full weight of American industrial production, deepening logistics networks, and an Allied command structure that, for all its friction and dysfunction, was capable of learning and scaling in ways the Axis could not match. The drama of the individual genius and the relentless machine was already written. Patton understood which side of that equation he occupied. The dangerous idea, the one that lingered in war colleges, in popular histories, in documentary narration, was that Rommel's failures were primarily intellectual, that if he had thought more clearly, manoeuvred more cleverly, perhaps the outcome could have shifted. This framing did something subtle but consequential. It reduced the war in North Africa to a contest of minds rather than a contest of systems. It made the story feel like a chess match, when the actual stakes were closer to one player having 30 pieces, and the other player watching half his pieces disappear from the board before the game began. Patton himself was not immune to the cult of Rommel. Accounts from his own circle suggest he read Rommel's published work before the North African campaign, that he engaged with the tactical frameworks Rommel had articulated. This was professional respect of a serious kind, not admiration for a celebrity. Patton treated Rommel as a problem to be solved, not an icon to be worshipped. But the tension inside that respect was real. Patton was a man who believed in the power of the individual will, in the commander who imposed his personality on a battlefield so completely that the outcome bent toward him. He believed this about himself. He had to engage seriously with the fact that Rommel appeared to believe it too, and had made it work, at least for a while. The problem with individual will, though, is that it runs on resources. It runs on ammunition, on gasoline, on soldiers who are fed and rested, and not already dying from diseases contracted in inadequate field hospitals. By 1943, Rommel was fighting with a shrinking hand. The will was still there. The machine behind the will was not. Patton's machine was getting larger every month, and that asymmetry was not something any amount of tactical brilliance could fully overcome. But the question deserves to be pushed further, because Rommel was not simply defeated by tonnage. He was also defeated by time, by intelligence failures, by the slow unravelling of a strategic situation that Hitler's decisions kept making worse. The problem of Rommel versus Patton was never cleanly a problem of genius versus logistics. It was something more unsettling than that. It was the story of what genius actually costs when the infrastructure beneath it collapses. Begin at the level of supply, because that is where the story actually begins. Rommel's reputation had been built in the desert on speed and psychological shock. He moved faster than his opponents expected, struck where they were unprepared, and used the disorientation of his enemy as a force multiplier. This was genuine military art, but it was also crucially a response to limitation. Rommel moved fast in part because he could not afford to stay still. Staying still meant his weaknesses became visible. Movement was also concealment. By the time the Americans arrived in force in North Africa, the strategic geometry had shifted in ways that made Rommel's methods increasingly expensive. The supply problem across the Mediterranean was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a deepening wound. British naval and air power was interdicting Axis shipping with growing effectiveness. The fuel and ammunition that reached North Africa was a fraction of what German and Italian commanders had planned for. When Rommel launched an offensive, he was sometimes gambling the last operational reserves on a breakthrough that, if it failed, would leave him worse off than before. Patton entered this environment with a different inheritance. American production, which had been scaling aggressively since 1941, was beginning to manifest on the battlefield in measurable ways. Replacement vehicles, replacement ammunition, replacement men. The American system could absorb punishment that the German system could not. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing that generated legendary stories, but it was the kind of thing that determined outcomes. The deeper layer of this story is what it reveals about the nature of military command. Rommel was, by nearly every serious account, a superb tactical commander. He read terrain quickly. He made decisions under pressure without freezing. He had the physical courage to be at the front when the front was moving. These were real qualities. Patton had some of them too. The courage, the speed of decision, the presence in the forward area. But Patton had something else. He had an institutional environment that was, despite its enormous flaws, oriented toward winning a modern industrial war. He had commanders above him who were learning, who were building the logistical networks that would eventually support an advance from Normandy to Germany itself. He was inside a system that was scaling toward overwhelming force. Then the silence became evidence of something else, because even inside Patton's world, the machine was not perfect. The Allied command structure was fractured by ego, by national interest, by generals who wanted credit and resented sharing it. Eisenhower was managing a coalition that required constant political maintenance. Montgomery and Patton existed in a state of sustained, barely controlled rivalry. The machine had political friction inside it, and Patton's position within that friction was always uncomfortable. He was useful, he was also ungovernable, and the men above him knew it. This tension, between Patton the asset and Patton the problem, is part of what the Rommel comparison illuminates. Rommel was also difficult to control. German commanders complained that he operated outside his mandate, that he advanced further than his orders permitted, that he created supply crises by moving faster than the logistics could follow. Both men shared a kind of command philosophy that made bureaucracies nervous. But Rommel's side was losing its capacity to support even brilliant improvisation. Patton's side was building capacity even when individual commanders behaved badly. The human cost inside this dynamic was carried by the soldiers on both sides who were asked to operate inside the gap between what commanders demanded and what the system could actually deliver. German soldiers in North Africa by 1943 were fighting with equipment that was wearing out, ammunition that was running low, and food that was increasingly inadequate. They continued to fight with real effectiveness. The German military's tactical competence did not simply evaporate. But the men in the forward positions knew, even when their commanders would not say it plainly, that the math had turned against them. The confrontation that clarifies everything does not happen on a single battlefield. It happens across a series of engagements where the structural reality gradually overwhelms the individual performance. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the Americans were defeated badly enough to trigger a crisis of confidence in Allied command. Patton was brought in to restore order and discipline in Second Corps. What he did in that period, the harsh imposition of standards, the relentless forward pressure, was partly theatre and partly genuine. He understood that the men under him needed to believe the machine they were part of could function. He was, in that moment, acting as the human interface between the individual soldier and the larger system. Rommel understood this too. Accounts from the period recognized that the American forces he faced were not the same forces that had been broken at Kasserine. The learning curve was real. The American system was not just absorbing the lesson, it was integrating the lesson into a new operational approach. Patton's arrival was a signal that the machine had the capacity to correct itself. Rommel's position did not have that same corrective capacity. What was broken stayed broken. The turning point is not a single moment of Patton outthinking Rommel. The turning point is the accumulation of structural advantage becoming so pronounced that brilliance on the German side could no longer compensate. By the spring of 1943, Rommel had already left North Africa for medical reasons, and the Axis forces in Tunisia were running out of everything: men, machines, will. The campaign ended in May 1943, with the surrender of over 200,000 Axis troops, one of the largest defeats in the history of the German army outside the Eastern Front. Patton was not the sole architect of that outcome. He was a significant force within a much larger coalition effort, but his role illustrates the central argument of the story. He was the kind of commander who could take a system that had stumbled and force it back into motion. He was not simply a man of tactical ideas. He was a man who understood that speed, aggression, and forward pressure were the ways to convert systemic advantage into battlefield reality before the enemy could recover. He made the machine run harder. The machine, in return, made what he was doing possible in a way it was never possible for Rommel. The short sentences belong here. Rommel had vision. He did not have fuel. He had brilliance. He did not have replacements. He had a plan. The plan required resources that no longer existed. Patton had a plan too. Behind his plan was the largest industrial economy on Earth, now pointed entirely at the problem. The consequences of this asymmetry extended far beyond North Africa. The pattern established in the desert, where American industrial and logistical capacity increasingly overwhelmed Axis operational skill, repeated itself in Sicily, in Italy, and ultimately across France and into Germany itself. German commanders continued to fight with tactical competence that military historians still study seriously. They continued to inflict casualties that were often disproportionate to the balance of forces. But the capacity to convert tactical success into strategic outcome was no longer there. Patton's subsequent campaigns, the breakout from Normandy, the drive across France, the relief of Bastogne, were all expressions of the same fundamental reality. He was a commander who made systems move at maximum speed. The systems behind him, by late 1944, were enormous. The supply challenges he faced were real and sometimes stopped his advance. But even those stops were temporary. The American system could and did solve logistical problems that German commanders could only watch develop without solution. Rommel's legacy in this context is something more complex than simple defeat. He demonstrated what individual operational genius could accomplish when it was given even a fraction of the resources it needed. His campaigns in France in 1940 and in North Africa between 1941 and 1942 are still studied because they represent genuine achievements under pressure, but they also demonstrate the ceiling of individual performance when the structural foundation begins to collapse. The political consequence of the comparison between these two commanders is that it forces honest engagement with what actually wins wars. Popular narratives prefer individual heroes. The historical record suggests that individual commanders matter most when they are embedded in systems that can support and scale what they accomplish. Patton was not a better general than Rommel because he was smarter. He was operating inside a machine that by 1943 had no equivalent on the Axis side. What this story reveals, beyond both men, is the uncomfortable truth about the relationship between individual excellence and systemic power. We want the story of war to be a story about minds and wills. We want to believe that the right commander, with enough vision and enough courage, can overcome the mathematics of production and supply. Rommel's story is so compelling precisely because it came so close to validating that belief. For a period in the desert, it seemed possible that one man's operational vision could stretch scarce resources further than anyone had a right to expect. But wars are ultimately settled by systems, by the capacity to absorb loss and continue, by the ability to correct mistakes faster than the enemy can exploit them, by the industrial depth that turns tactical reverses into temporary setbacks rather than fatal collapses. Patton understood this even as he played the role of the individual genius. He knew that what gave him his battlefield freedom was everything behind him, that he never mentioned in the speeches he gave, standing on tank hoods. The final lesson is not that brilliance is irrelevant. The final lesson is that brilliance without support is eventually just a spectacular form of losing. Rommel needed a machine equal to his vision. He never had one. Patton had one, and he drove it harder than almost anyone else of his generation. The difference between them was not finally a question of genius. It was a question of what genius was given to work with. A mind without a machine can dazzle. Only the machine decides who goes home.